Wakey wakey, welcome to Wakefield in West Yorkshire. We're here at the Chantry Chapel of St Mary the Virgin, said to be one of the oldest and certainly the most elaborate medieval bridge chapels surviving in Britain. And in fact it's one of only 5 or 6 medieval bridge chapels that has survived to this day, and it played an important part in the Battle of Wakefield, which was fought about a mile from here in 1460 during the Wars of the Roses on the 30th of December. And it's there where Richard the Duke of York gave battle in vain and was killed on the battlefield, and where his son Edmund, in trying to escape from the battle over this bridge, was killed by his enemy Clifford, as immortalised by Shakespeare in Henry VI Part 3. So we're going to be exploring the chapel here, inside and out. We're going to head up to the battlefield to look at the monument there, and also the ruins of Sandal Castle, which once belonged to the Duke of York. We're going to be finishing off to find the original facade of the chapel, because this is not it. My name is Chris, this is Church Searcher, and I'll see you after the map. So the bridge here has got 9 arches. It's about 92 metres long, crossing the River Calder, and it was built between 1342 and 1356. And it was in 1356 that the chapel here was licensed, ready to be used. It was built out of ashlar sandstone on an island in the middle of the river, and it actually forms one of the buttresses of the bridge. So it's a fundamental part of the construction of the bridge. You can see the lower course is that original sandstone, and that forms the vestry and the sacristy of the chapel, where they will prepare for services above and where they will keep their vestments and altar cloths. The upper part of the chapel has actually been restored later. You can also see the opposite side there's an octagonal tower, which is the original bell tower for the chapel. So this was one of 4 chantry chapels here in Wakefield. Chantry chapels had priests who were paid for by wealthy benefactors to say prayers and masses for their souls and loved ones. And so priests here were being paid for by the benefactors who built the bridge, but also by travellers who were crossing over here who paid for masses to be said for them and for their loved ones. Now the priests on bridge chantry chapels also took tolls from those people crossing over, and that obviously helped pay for the bridge and for the upkeep of the chapel. And you can see we've got St Christopher on the front of the chapel as patron saint of travellers carrying Christ over the river. So this is one of 5 or 6 surviving bridge chapels in the UK. There's another one in Rotherham, and there's another one of a similar date in Derby. But we know the specific date of this one, whereas Derby is a bit more unclear. So it's thought this is perhaps the earliest one to survive in Britain. Now chantry chapels went out of use between 1545 and 1547 during the English Reformation, when there was an Act of Parliament banning them. So at that point they became used for more secular reasons, and so this became a warehouse and a cheesecake shop. The Salvation Army used the vestry at one point, so it's had various uses over the years. Now in 1842 the chapel here was returned to the Anglican Church, the Church of England, and it was restored by the Yorkshire Architectural Society, influenced by the Oxford movement. Now the Oxford movement was kind of a high church tradition out of the University of Oxford, and they were arguing for more Catholic traditions to be reinstated into the Anglican faith, and they hired George Gilbert Scott to completely restore the upper part of the chapel here. Now he was a famous Gothic revivalist architect responsible for the spectacular Midland Hotel at St Pancras Station in London, as well as the Albert Memorial in Kensington Gardens. Now, he completely rebuilt the chapel at pavement level out of cairn stone from France, rather than the original ashlar sandstone. Now, unfortunately, this wasn't really suitable for the amount of pollution around in the air during the Victorian period here in Wakefield, and that very soft stone began crumbling away. And so the facade we see here was actually constructed in 1939 to replace that second facade. So this is the third iteration of the facade on the front of the chapel here. Now, the original facade actually survives to some extent down in the local park, which we'll try and find later. But on the front of this you can see various saints depicted, and also there's 5 panels depicting scenes from the Bible. So the 5 panels depict the Annunciation on the left, followed by the Nativity, and then the Resurrection itself, and then the Ascension next to that. Now, the final panel originally depicted the coronation of the Virgin Mary, but instead replaced it by the descent of the Holy Ghost. Now, since 1991, care of this chapel has passed to the Friends of Wakefield Chapel, and you can see on the sides here there's all these heads and busts representing various people who are involved in the restoration projects of the chapel here, and they mirror some of the more heavily eroded original faces on the other side of the chapel. So they depict the Bishop of Wakefield, Lady St Oswald of Nostell Priory, which is a stately home not far from here. You've also got the Right Honourable Walter Harrison, who was a Labour MP for Wakefield between 1964 and 1987, and Canon Brian Alice, as well as Ray Peralvin, who was founding member of the Friends of Wakefield Chapel. So the Friends of Wakefield Chapel still hold regular services here on a monthly basis, and there's also a memorial service every year on the 30th of December to commemorate the fallen at the Battle of Wakefield. So come with me as we go and have a look inside and see some of its unique features. So inside the chapel, the beautiful Victorian stained glass windows were created by Barnet and Son of York, and also Wales of Newcastle. And the main east window shows moments in the life of Jesus, from the Ascension and the Resurrection back to his birth. And the scenes depicted in the south side includes Jesus preaching in the temple, being baptised by John, and also his miracle at the wedding in Cana. The busts on the inside of the windows are all made from that cairn stone that George Gilbert Scott used. So you can see the amount of degradation and erosion that they've been subjected to even on the inside of the chapel. So it gives you an idea of what the facade must have looked like before it was replaced. To the right of the east window there's a canopied niche which once actually stood outside, holding a statue of the Virgin Mary carrying a perpetual light which would burn, guiding travellers towards the bridge. It was since moved inside when it actually fell off the outside of the chapel. To the left of the window is a little door which leads down to the sacristy and vestry, but also up to the little bell tower which we could see outside. You can just notice there's a tiny hole where the bell ringers could look through to communion and know when it was the right time to ring the bell. We've also got the remains of the basina to the right of the altar, and at the rear of the church, where the stoop once stood to wash your hands on entering the church, we've now got the baptismal font.
So this is Sandal Castle, just on the outskirts of Wakefield, where Richard, Duke of York, arrived on the 21st of December 1460 to suppress the Lancastrian armies who were amassing here in the north, in Hull, and particularly at Pontefract Castle, which is about 9 miles away from here. But the castle here was originally completed in the year 1130 as a earth and timber motte and bailey castle. You can see the motte here, the mound, and this was the bailey around us here. By the end of the 12th century, the castle was then started to be replaced by stone, and by the time of 1460, when the Battle of Wakefield took place, this castle belonged to Richard, the Duke of York. So the Wars of the Roses were a series of battles and feuds which lasted for about 30 years between 1455 and 1485, between two rival groups, both supporting rival claimants to the English throne. So you had the Lancastrians on one side and the House of York on the other. So things really began in 1422 with the ascension to the throne of King Henry VI at the age of just 9 months old. Now, according to the historical records that we've got, he's thought of as being a pretty ineffectual leader. He had bouts of mental instability throughout his life, and during the course of his reign there were lots of disagreements between the nobles about the way the war with France, the 100 Years' War, was being prosecuted. Richard, the Duke of York, actually acted as Lieutenant of France for a while, and he undertook quite an aggressive policy, trying to retake and regain lands that had been lost to the French. His successor and rival, however, Edmund, the Duke of Somerset, had a more conciliatory approach, trying to negotiate peace by giving concessions to the French. Now, Richard, Duke of York, was one of the most wealthy and powerful nobles in the whole of the kingdom, and he himself was descended through both parents from King Edward III, so there were calls to have him named as heir to Henry VI, who at that point was without child. Now, it was in 1453 that King Henry VI had a complete mental breakdown, and Richard, Duke of York, was named as Lord Protector, ruling in his stead for 18 months until the king had a recovery. Now, during that time, he'd also had a son with his wife, Margaret of Anjou. The son was Prince Edmund. And so this put a massive spanner in the works of the plans of Richard, Duke of York, and his supporters. So, in 1455, they took matters into their own hands, and a battle ensued, known as the First Battle of St Albans, which was a Yorkist victory. Henry VI was captured there, and an uneasy truce was negotiated until more battles broke out in 1459, and then in 1460 at the Battle of Northampton, where again King Henry VI was captured, and he was basically placed under house arrest in the Bishop's Palace in London. Richard, Duke of York, subsequently marched upon Parliament, intending to seize the throne, but instead Parliament enacted the Act of Accord, which named Richard, Duke of York, as the heir to Henry VI, effectively ignoring Prince Edmund. So subsequently, Margaret of Anjou and her son Edmund fled and evaded their enemies, eventually ending up at Harlech Castle in Wales amongst their supporters. And it's there they began to amass their armies again, along with the Lancastrian houses here in the north of England. And with about 15,000 men, they amassed in Hull and at Pontefract Castle, about 9 miles from here. And so it's then on the 9th of December that Richard, Duke of York, marched north with about 8,000 to 9,000 men, finally arriving here at Sandal Castle on the 21st of December. So looking from the keep up here at Sandal Castle, you can look down onto Wakefield Green, which is where the battlefield was. Now, the medieval chronicles and historians kind of disagree on the reason as to why Richard, Duke of York, decided to leave the safety of Sandal Castle, march his troops down Many Gates Lane, and take on the Lancastrian army in Wakefield Green down below us here. The Lancastrian army numbered about 15,000 from what we can tell, whereas the Yorkist army was between 8,000 and 9,000 men. But it's from up here on the top of the mountain where the keep would have been that we can see the lay of the land. There's this flat plateau where the castle is, and you can see just on the edge is like a blue-white cottage, and there's a sharp drop down towards Wakefield there. Lots of trees around still to this day. And so it's conceivable that the full nature of the Lancastrian force was perhaps concealed from Richard, Duke of York. Now when he arrived here, obviously he was quite short on provisions, having made the march north, and he sent word to his son in Wales to send reinforcements. So one of the theories is that rather than decide to hold out in a siege here with lack of provisions and wait for the reinforcements to come, he instead saw a force that pretty much approximated the same number of soldiers as his own force, and decided to take the risk and to ride out and to engage them in combat. However, the Lancastrian forces actually split into two, or perhaps even 3 units, with troops hidden around the sides here in the trees and the woods. And so when Richard, Duke of York, went out across Wakefield Green to engage the Lancastrians, he was also hit in the flank and then cut off at the rear. There are several other theories put forward in the medieval chronicles as well, one being the idea that false flags were used down on the battlefield to give the impression that reinforcements had arrived. There's also the idea put forward that the Neville family from Raby Castle with their forces actually changed allegiances at the start of the battle. So that was about 8,000 men who swapped sides to the Lancastrians. There's yet another theory that there was actually a truce which was negotiated to hold over Christmas, which was due to end on Epiphany, 6th of January. But after a series of heralds were sent taunting Richard, Duke of York, he finally left the safety of the castle. So, Richard, the Duke of York, marched his forces out of Sandal Castle, down Many Gates Lane here, and met the main Lancastrian forces on Wakefield Green. And what is now Castle Grove Park forms pretty much the central part of the battlefield. You can just make out some ridge and furrow in the low winter sun. So it's down here on Wakefield Green that the Duke of York met and faced the main Lancastrian forces led by Lords Somerset and Clifford. Now, unbeknownst to the Duke of York, there were also Lancastrian forces led by Ross and the Duke of Wiltshire concealed in the woods around here. And it's those forces who hit the Yorkists in the flank and also from behind, cutting off retreat of the Yorkists back up to Sandal Castle, effectively boxing in Richard the Duke of York and his men here on Wakefield Green. And it's this monument behind me which is said to mark the spot where Richard, Duke of York, was mortally wounded and fell. So it's from here that Richard the Duke of York's son, Edmund, tried to escape down Many Gates Lane and cross over Wakefield Bridge where the chapel is. But it's there where he was cut down by Lord Clifford, whose own father had been killed at the Battle of St Albans. Now this horrific scene is depicted in Shakespeare's Henry VI Part 3, and we're going to be going now to try and find the original facade of the chapel which witnessed that horrific event. Now after their defeat, the heads of Richard the Duke of York, his son Edmund and Edmund's uncle were displayed on spikes on Micklegate Bar in York. That's the royal gateway into York. Richard the Duke of York's head was made to wear a paper crown, and around his neck there was a sign, which read, "May York look over the town of York." So it was in 1832 that the facade of the chapel was removed, ready for it to be replaced by George Gilbert Scott. And the stones were moved to Kettlethorpe Hall, which is a house near here, and they were used as the facade of a folly boathouse. But when that began to fall apart and be vandalised, it was moved into storage by the council in 1996, where it remained until it was transferred here around 2014 to Thorne Park, and you can see it here in the secret garden hidden away in the rockery. So it's not quite what I expected, to be honest, but laid on its side you can kind of see a lot of the detail in it that's being copied in the reproduction at the chapel itself. These are the ashlar sandstone blocks that would have witnessed the killing of Edmund, Duke of Rutland, by Clifford, as immortalised by Shakespeare in Henry VI, Part 3. Now, I'm no actor, but I'll run you briefly through the scene. It's scene 3, and it begins with Clifford chasing down Edmund and his tutor, just to emphasise Edmund's age. The tutor begs for Edmund's life and is dragged away by Clifford's soldiers, leaving Clifford and Edmund to face each other. And Edmund says, "Our gentle Clifford, kill me with thy sword, and not with such a cruel threatening look. Sweet Clifford, hear me speak before I die. I am too mean a subject for thy wrath. Be thou revenged on men, and let me live." And Clifford replies, "In vain thou speakest, poor boy. My father's blood hath stopped the passage where thy words should enter." And Clifford finishes with, "It could not slake mine ire, nor ease my heart. The sight of any of the house of York is a fury to torment my soul. Until I root out their accursed line, and leave not one alive, I live in hell. Therefore," and it's at that point he raises his rapier to kill Edmund. So that is a summary of the history of the Chantry Chapel here in Wakefield, from its first construction through to its reproduction, its eventual demise here, and its involvement in the Battle of Wakefield. If you want to support the Friends of Wakefield Chantry Chapel, I'll leave the link down below. You can donate, you can join as a friend. They have services regularly at the chapel there. There's also a service every year on the 30th of December to commemorate those fallen at the Battle of Wakefield itself. So, I hope to see you soon in the next video, but until then, keep church searching.